Thank you again for joining us. And now to begin our program.
Hello, and welcome everyone to today's AAMC Foundation webinar. I'm Douglas Hegley, Chief Digital Officer at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, and I will be serving as your moderator for today's session. Today, we're going to engage in a dialogue with our four distinguished panelists who bring their knowledge and slightly different perspectives to the topic at hand. I encourage you throughout the session to submit your questions or thoughts via the Q&A functionality, which you'll find along the bottom border of the Zoom window. We'd like to address what's on your mind, and we'll save time to do that near the end of the session. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists. Briefly, in the interest of time, to learn more about them, please visit artcurators.org where you can get their full bios. But we are fortunate today to have with us Dupe Ajayi, who's the intersectional marketing strategist at the Shed in New York City. Annie Fletcher, the director of the Irish Museum of Modern Art in Dublin. Heather Sherwin, director of development, Chrysler Museum of Art in Norfolk, Virginia, and Victoria Stashuk, who is the founder of Victoria Stashuk and Associates, an arts and culture consulting firm. Thank you all of us for joining us today. By way of framing what we're talking about this morning, today's topic revolves around the positioning of digital at this moment in time. We are more than half a year into this COVID-19 global pandemic. And if it's proven anything, it's proven that digital is important, perhaps more important than ever. More important than perhaps we had anticipated. But we're also living through a time of closures, of extreme losses of revenue, particularly earned revenue. How can we frame these things in terms of sustainability or monetization? Can digital help, I guess, is the ultimate question. I want to turn to our panelists now because they have a lot of interesting things to say. I want to start with some framing, panelists. So why is this topic compelling to you? What problem are we trying to solve? And let's start with Dupe.
So thank you so much, and thank you for having me to represent the Shed here. This is very important conversation. This topic is so important to me because rooted in the midst of all of it is access. And my job is to make sure that people who normally wouldn't experience arts institutions for whatever reason, that traditional audiences, that that very title, that very frame is thrown out of the window, and that all audiences are welcomed into art spaces. So digital is one way that naturally you're able to allow so many more people who wouldn't normally have access on the surface of it all. However, it does create some barriers at the same time. There's a risk of that at the same time. People may not have access to, computers. In this very country, we're reading about people sitting outside of libraries in order to obtain Wi-Fi access just to do schoolwork. And so for me, I'm constantly looking at, and as someone who is into digital, I'm constantly obsessed with the innovation that's happening in this area, but at the same time, remembering and looking at new ways, different ways for us to make sure that no one gets left behind. So what are we solving to? It's a very interesting question with a lot of answers. Well, first I would say is that, revenue and it being a revenue stream for institutions, to me, that is, the obvious answer. In addition to that, it's meeting people where they are. How do you do that? Which is what I nodded to. And then how do you provide content that is compelling enough? Sometimes we think that just because we build it, they will come. And that's not necessarily the case. What is it that we're sharing that resonates with an audience? What is it? How is it relevant to them? Is your institution even relevant to them? And how is what you're sharing relevant to them? So those are three of the main pillars that I focus on, my teams focus on at the Shed almost each and every day for the past 7, 8, 9, 10 months now.
Thank you, Dupe. Annie, would you mind weighing in from the museum director perspective on these questions?
Sure. Thank you very much. And thank you also so much for inviting me. It's really an honor and very exciting and stimulating to be part of this company and this conversation. I think for all of those questions, I have a sub-question. So of course, we've all realized how important the digital is anyway in our practice, but it has been absolutely turbocharged and exacerbated by the pandemic in relation to indeed issues of accessibility. One question, I suppose, or sub-question that I have is how we understand the notion of it being a resource, because I could actually talk very succinctly about why it has opened up my entire institution internally as well. The fact that we're all at home, the fact that we're isolated in particular ways is dramatic, is difficult. The fact that we can communicate over Zoom, has brought an awful lot of people who sort of refused this level of technology in my institution online really quickly. So that's a huge positive already. I mean, these are very obvious things, but I think they can't be discounted if we understand and strategize around what we mean by the digital. Secondly, what it has allowed me to do, and I'm only the director of this museum for about 2 years now, or 1.5 years, it's allowed me to unseat an awful lot of sedimented silos in the museum, different departments, different disciplines, people who didn't speak to each other. I have been able through creating different cross-functional Zoom teams to really allow us to develop much bigger horizons, much more interdisciplinary practice. That somehow maybe using the excuse of the pandemic, I could say, but also the capacity of the digital has allowed in extraordinary ways. So people who wouldn't necessarily meet each other at the water cooler or whatever actually can now. And I would even extend that in relation to accessibility to the international sphere. We're no longer traveling for 4 days to make a presentation, as a friend of mine said the other day, for 25 minutes. We now can make that presentation internationally, whether it's in Mumbai or Manila. We can share our knowledge, and we can allow ourselves this kind of great reset about how we come together in a convivial way through digital formats that perhaps we really hadn't considered in the same way. We privileged the idea of the gathering and the flights and the economic problems in relation to that. And all of these platforms have allowed that in an incredible way. But secondly, of course, the way in which to think our programs. There are limits, of course. There are filmmakers who don't want their work to be seen on a computer screen. There are all kinds of ways in which we want to treat artworks and archives with integrity on the screen. But surely that's our job. We're curators, we're organizers. We need to think about how those infrastructures impact in relation to these possibilities. And that I actually find very exciting. For example, we developed a program called Screen, which was going back into our film archive and arranging the screening for a month of a film that perhaps has not been shown in the museum for a long time. But in order to kind of attend to those issues, we also recorded a new interview with the artist, allowing them to look back, to dig into the archive with us. So there's a chance to not only reuse, redisperse, share materials in these really innovative ways, as Dupe said, but also to really start to think about how to re-energize things with the digital if we're deliberate and if we're careful.
Thank you, Annie. Heather, your responsibility is raising money. This must be an interesting time for you. Can you give us your perspective on these things? You need to unmute yourself.
It's my worst habit. Harking back to some of the things Dupe said about access and how in typical development fashion, a lot of times you're a member and that allows you access to the knowledge of an art museum or the knowledge of our curators. And so when we're a free museum and membership is actually more like a donation with some limited access, but I was thinking about what we did. One of the things we did was we started a 5-piece series with living artists and a 5-piece series with curators. And we packaged it as you could, if you joined as a member, all of those 10 sessions were free. And if you wanted to pay by session, it was $15. I can't say that we made very much money. There weren't a lot of $15 people, but we had members participate. And so, I mean, we're experimenting, like what works, what's the price point, what's the time of day. What I loved about some of our, especially living artist pieces was, you know, at 2 o'clock on a Saturday, this Dawit, a local photographer, artist, 164 members of his church were able to attend this event for this young artist, emerging artist. So there's like upsides to this sort of access piece, going back to who can come. And we have one of the living artists is going to be talking to us from Israel. Like you said, Annie, we would have had to fly her here to do that. So I think there's upsides and downsides. So then how do you monetize that? I'm very much interested in this conversation of the paywall, and can we give more to our more content and more access for free? And then what can we do after they participate to up donations, up memberships, up engagement? And I don't have the answer yet, but we're experimenting.
Thank you, Heather. And Victoria, you bring the unique perspective of providing services to multiple organizations. So what are you seeing in your practice in this regard?
Well, I want to talk a little bit about something you mentioned to us panelists a little bit earlier on, was that culture track study, where they actually looked at arts and culture consumers in the US during COVID. And what I found really interesting was the digital content was consumed by a younger and more diverse audience than what you would normally see if you were walking around the museum or the art gallery or going to performing arts. So I found that really interesting in terms of an opportunity to be more accessible to a larger swath of people and to get our heads around that as an opportunity. And the other thing I wanted to talk about was my practical experience, which is as a volunteer at the McMichael Art Gallery that's just north of Toronto in Kleinburg. And it started out as a place for the group of 7, but now it is a place for all the art of Canada. And so I had been plugged into some technology sales circles, and they were talking about the danger of going dark and losing audiences and all of that. And then they decided that in the tech circles, they were saying, okay, well, maybe it's a time to mend your nets. Like if you were a fisherman or a fisher person, that's what you'd be doing. You'd be mending your nets in the wintertime. So I thought that was a really interesting opportunity for cultural institutions that might have started their digital strategies, and they, you know, what were they going to do now? So interestingly, the McMichael decided to really respond in a big way to not go dark. So they trained up the volunteers and docents to do virtual tours for free of the group of 7. And now we're doing Indigenous art as well. And then also they had a whole McMichael at Home program where curators on Instagram would do interviews with artists and all of that. So I was really quite impressed with how we responded to keep our audiences engaged. And at the last volunteer meeting, the curators thanked very much the docents for responding so quickly to pivot to learn Zoom and all of that. And they were really seeing the benefit in terms of the engagement with the gallery and everything. And one of the interesting things in terms of access is that I would see older, disabled people listening to us. And when I was thinking of those very early days where people felt so lonely, and if they couldn't get out, I thought that was really an amazing thing we were doing. And then also we'd be having audiences of people from the UK, and they'd be going, oh, now where is that again in Canada? So that was really interesting. And then on the Indigenous tours, it was very interesting when we'd have participation from the States and some Indigenous communities in the States wanting to know more about Indigenous up here. And then the other thing that was really fascinating was that they were saying that for us, yes, we're doing the virtual tours for free, but one of the big revenue, because we are doing time ticketing on the weekends now at the gallery, So we're very limited in terms of the numbers coming through, but they were saying one of the things that has been a revenue maker for us is educational online programming. So those people that are interested in learning how to do art and, you know, taking advantage of our educational staff and all of that. So it's interesting to kind of see that you had also talked about this sort of downstream opportunities that Heather had referred to too. And so at the end of the, first off in the tours when they just started, you know, we said everything was free. And then at the end, we kind of did this plug for, you know, go online, you know, give us a donation, become a member, that kind of thing. And one of the times when I was doing that plug, someone pipes up and says, well, actually, you know, I'm a Canadian. I work and live in the States. I have a cottage in Canada and I've really missed Canada. And I, you know, so it was really neat to hear all of those little comments. So I'm sorry if it's somewhat anecdotal, but I thought it might connect with some of the people out there.
Thank you, Victoria. And I enjoy the specific examples that each of you are bringing up. And already in our Q&A, there's interest. Heather, you threw out the term paywall. And I think we, as in practicing and thinking about this session, we talked about some different concepts for monetization of digital. Paywall is certainly a concept where people can't get to the content without paying some kind of fee. And that's direct, immediate revenue. But there are other options, right? Pay what you wish, free, sometimes free with a donation button. And there's curiosity already from our attendees around which of these has worked for you, which of these are you thinking about experimenting with? Heather, since you started the topic, I'll start with you.
Well, we've tried. So with yoga, it's pay what you can, and with the artist series and the curator series, there was definitely a fee to start, and we kind of were like thinking maybe we should remove the fee because we weren't getting the kind of participation that we were really hoping for. But then we decided to ride it out and use the series, record the series and use it as an available thing later. We're experimenting depending on the audience. We have a huge glass studio. We have a glass studio with live blowing, art glass blowing on demonstrations on a daily basis. So we are using the make a donation after you see the demo. So we're trying in different places, and it's not a really perfect science yet.
Thanks, Heather. Dupe, have you been working in options in this way?
So we haven't explored any of these options externally as yet. But of course, conversations are happening around which would we use and when they would be appropriate. And so it has been, and also too looking at looking at other ways of getting people in to view the content and then kind of testing, engaging whether or not this is something someone would want to later on pay for, or another version of it would be, you know, something that people would pay for based on audience, based on data. And so we're still kind of testing. This summer, we centered artists from New York, and we knew that community would be, you know, most hard hit. And, you know, being here in the epicenter, you know, everything was happening so quickly. This audience was one that was hit immediately, and we decided that we would pivot to digital and use this as an opportunity to center them through a program called Up Close. And Up Close has been so amazing, so impactful. I don't say that only because I work at the Shed, but because it is compelling and it is timely, and it gives up people the opportunity to address, you know, issues that are impacting all of us in real time. It is quite relevant. And again, it goes to what I was saying earlier, is looking at the relevancy of this. So we're putting out this work, and by looking at the data is telling us, is this relevant to our audiences right now? And if it is, how then where are the opportunities for us to consider monetization around some of these components? So it may not be that, okay, well, here we have everything, let's add, a paywall to it. But where would there be opportunities for us to test this? If one of the offerings did really well, would we iterate and then offer that later on behind a paywall? And then, of course, looking at the soft ask and the recommendation for individuals to pay what they wish is another one, of course, that we also too are taking a look at. So right now we're in the sandbox. We're playing to see what will actually work. We don't want to put off audiences. And just a quick example that's not that's more relevant to pop culture and outside culture. We've seen, some examples of those providing this kind of consistent drumbeat of content. There's something called Versus. I don't know if you guys are all familiar with it, but it's a battle between, say a Patti LaBelle and, Gladys Knight. And, Versus right now is in its, 10th iteration. But anyway, this is free content. And, on one of them alone, you can have 6 million impressions, 6 million viewers. And I'm obsessed with this model because I'm thinking, oh my gosh, everybody convenes for this moment. It's 3 hours on end, it's live. And you across the board from gospel to R&B to soul and all of this. You have Michelle Obama in there. You have other arts and culturals commenting. And I think the reason why it does so well, and it's free, but sponsored, right? And I think the reason why this does so well is because the content, as I said, is relevant to audiences all over the world. It's a meeting space or place, if you will, for everyone to convene and celebrate this moment in time as a community. And so I'm constantly looking at these types of models to kind of bring forth. I mean, we could only wish that Michelle Obama or whoever was commenting for one of our things, but I'm always looking outside of our space for these inspirations and seeing how we would then, copy that and then iterate on that and monetize it.
Thank you, Dupe. And I want to come back to sponsorship soon, but I want to also sort of, Annie, I would like us to explore a little bit of something that I jokingly said yesterday, no money, no mission, right? That even as nonprofits, without revenue, without earnings, we can't pay the bills, we can't pay the staff. And is there a conflict? Is there some kind of ethical or values conflict in this, even this idea of monetization of content? How does a museum director feel about that? Unmute, please.
We should all have these t-shirts with please mute, unmute. I'm sorry. I don't think there's a conflict. I think the model in Europe is probably quite different. I mean, we are, one of the last vestiges of the social welfare state. Our revenue is 6 million, and most of that comes from the government. So anything we earn over and above that goes into our programming for sure. But I'm not furloughing staff. We're using the digital on that level to again get our visitor engagement team to audit the website, to augment it, to do all that mending of the net, as Victoria said so beautifully. It's true. It's this idea of thinking the digital as a way to kind of convene skills on certain levels. No, I'm definitely thinking about how to monetize experience. I mean, we used to run huge concerts on the grounds here. There was a business model that gave us revenue. So I'm also just very aware of the newspaper model. The paywall. We understand that newspapers are not surviving well since the a rise of the digital. If we look at it as a whole sphere. So I don't think we should be naive on that level. We should look at that. The Guardian in London just let off 150 workers. That's really significant for such a flagship newspaper. So, I mean, if the newspapers can't sort it out, we should really look at that. Is this model sustainable? I love what you said, Dupa, about the idea of, there's a lot to be said for the trending and the kind of democratization of media. And sometimes I think my staff, including me, aren't young enough to really understand the emerging things. And we were talking the other day about the idea that during lockdown, as we're walking along, all you see are 12-year-old kids, including my daughter, dancing to TikTok, right? I mean, it's a cliche, but it's true. And it's this idea of cultural models of expression and us understanding how to work with those as well, which is very much what is so innovative about the digital. I mean, I'm looking more at the idea of if I'm monetizing digitally, the thing I'm thinking about is more trying to stage literally corporate events rather than assuming that regular people, public, will pay. So we're looking at, bespoke events which allow for longer conversations or, some kind of replica of the exclusivity of a members event, but maybe trying to ratchet that up with other kind of conversations that might be part of it for bespoke companies in the way that we used to give them space in the museum. So it's like, could we create digital space like that? And the other thing for me that I'm thinking strategically about, and I don't know, again, I'm in the sandbox too, is the idea that, we're all in lockdown technically, sometimes just feeling like you can be back in the architecture feels very exclusive. So I think there's ways in which we can do tours or celebrate the sites that we're in that people can't physically get to, that sometimes we don't think about, that idea of filling that gap or giving people that experience. And I'm quite interested in that. I mean, we have an incredibly beautiful building from the 17th century. So there's that, but we all have interesting architectures and spaces. And just because we can't be physically in them doesn't mean we couldn't share or monetize that experience in another way too, I think.
Thank you. I have to confess, as the digital guy, it warms my heart to hear you using terms like sandbox. One of the great things about digital is that it's not written in ink. It's not carved in stone. And you can try things today and then you can change them and try them again tomorrow. Victoria, in your practice, are you coming to organizations and making recommendations about monetization, or are you seeing any success stories with the organizations with whom you work?
I wanted to speak a little bit about the McMichael experience for the new audiences, because there was a question down below about how are you accessing new audiences. So there was the Michael at Home program that I talked about earlier that was promoted through our member newsletter, and then there would be the curators interviewing artists or doing a staff talk that would be seen as like, oh, the inside scoop kind of thing. So it wasn't like during severe lockdown, people could not come on site. So those were really valued experiences for people. And then the other thing about how are we promoting the virtual tours? So through Facebook and Twitter, we would promote the virtual tours. And the first virtual tour we did was on the Group of Seven, and we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of them because their first show was in 1920. And for those of you in the United States, you may know that Steve Martin was a big fan of one of them, Lauren Harris. So, there's different ways that we have a marketing staff and the educational staff. We're working very closely together on those messages and branding and all of that really helped. And then we had volunteers delivering the program in terms of the virtual tours. So that's an example of how what I know practically. In terms of my consulting practice, I've been looking at that culture track survey that you talked about earlier, and it said that those collecting institutions, those ones that are arts and heritage, have traditionally had a little bit more success in seeming like that people can access them during the COVID time period, and that the performing arts have been hit very hard. So one of the things that I thought was an interesting discussion up here was the Winnipeg Art Gallery made some of their space accessible to performing arts on their rooftop. So the idea that, we would help out our other cultural organizations, brothers and sisters, I thought was a really good example too. In your own community, there may be also, layoffs in the performing arts. So I thought that was a nice thing that some of our institutions were doing it.
Thank you, Victoria. I want to circle back around on this idea of sponsorship, because this is an interesting topic, I think, around monetization, because we have been thinking a lot about going directly to our audiences and asking for revenue, whether that's, pay to play or that's please make a donation. Heather, I'm sorry, I don't mean to pick on you, but I want to start with the fundraiser again. How do you position the difference between sort of direct asks to either, members, donors, customers, versus looking for free content but a sponsorship in the back end? How do you handle the subtleties and nuances of that?
I have actually pitched a series to a corporate sponsor with the notion that they would get sort of a 30-second advertorial moment at the beginning to talk about why they support the arts in the Hampton Roads region. They didn't take me up on it. I think having to do with, again, it's new. They don't know what kind of, what kind of return they're going to get. It's also hard. I was also having a difficulty from pricing it, for that matter. Is it a same sponsorship as I would have if they were speaking at a dinner to only 200 people, when in fact this might be reaching 600, 700 people in the number of impressions? How do you calculate that? Anyway, that ask wasn't successful, but I'm not giving up. I have used, in a previous role, was running a giving day, which was entirely online. It's a lot like Giving Tuesday for those of you who use that. And there are corporations that get it and do want to be part of those digital impressions that you can sell. You're selling your audience, basically. So I'm not giving up on that. And if that answers your question, I swear.
Yeah, I think like we've been saying, it's sort of ongoing iteration and experimentation. Annie, I think you were talking more about a sort of corporate experience that a corporate organization would pay for their employees or executives or some combination thereof to experience something in the museum. Can you unpack that a little bit more? Have you had any of these events and have they been successful?
Yeah, I mean, it's something we did as a model generally anyway. Here we, it's offering that service of somehow an away day or an experience. Used to be on site, used to be with the show. So we're just about to develop one now. So I think that's the way to go. I think it's simply trying to offer a cohesive experience that they would understand digitally. It just means that you have to think about more than just a tour or something passive. You have to think about something interactive as well. One of the things we're working with a really interesting young kind of communication and marketing sort of strategist group, and they're talking about the notion that the old corporate models are dead anyway, like in the pandemic, so we really, really need to embrace the idea of rethinking them. And they were discussing with me the idea that we should be talking about the Great Reset. A lot of really innovative corporates are talking about the notion that old corporate models are dead, that we need to think about people, politics, and the planet. So if we can describe our places as catalysts for change, or spaces in which we can encourage them to come and rethink, to me that seems like a more interesting model than just servicing a kind of entertainment or a sort of a bespoke, beautiful event, which is probably how Emma certainly used to deal with corporate groups.
Thank you. And that, the old way of doing this is dead is, it can be both terrifying and exciting at the same time. In our Q&A, people are asking a little bit, I'm going to turn to you, Dupe, with your expertise, but people are asking a little bit about connecting or finding these new audiences. Any tips, any tricks to sort of outreach, or where do you go to locate these folks who aren't your traditional, museum going people?
Again, this group that I was talking to are talking about geolocating younger communities, understanding, really dealing with the digital as a way of mining data and understanding if we decide it's just a local community, how do we attend to where young people are hanging out online, for example? I mean, I think you can be quite strategic about these things.
And Dupe, your career, I think, is about outreach and marketing. How do you sort of approach this?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Like, you're kind of reading my mind as we go along here, which is scary. But I was thinking about prior to being at the Shed, I was working with the Brooklyn Public Library and digital fundraising and engagement. People love the library here. And the library doesn't have trouble. They're in a kind of a good position because they are a content behemoth. All of the content is there. Their audiences are used to engaging them in a digital way. So they were among the first here in New York that I saw go to that model kind of seamlessly. Everything from story times to, bingos, like they're just, this is what they do here and they do it really well. But then again, kind of like being very nuanced with what type of content they offer, when, where, how, and they never because the library is free. There's never an ask. The asks are done at specific, in specific ways at specific times. And so that's interesting. And then totally you remove me from that kind of environment that's been around for forever to the Shed, which is just about a year old. And you have no problem with audience engagement for a group or an entity that everybody loves. We were new, period, and in the middle of this, and we had to build up an audience, period. And I think one of the keys for us has been being very explicit about who we are and what we are about, and that is signaling audiences. Part of the work that I do too is heavy with partner engagement. And I recently had a woman who works with one of our very large city partners here in New York. And she's new to her role. She said to me, I'm very familiar with what you guys do. You uplift young people, you uplift people from diverse audiences, you uplift diverse artists. And I thought, wow, because we're not saying that, but the work is speaking for itself and it's signaling to who we want and who we want to be, in our family. And I think being consistent in doing that is part of the key to this work. Audience engagement and audience building takes a long time. I have worked with marketing entities that have humongous budgets, and they know that. It doesn't happen overnight. And I think some of us, we got caught in the middle of this. And now we're looking at, audience building as well as one of our pillars to being good marketers on top of everything else. But I think as long as you are authentically doing what you do, I'm obsessed with Annie's work as well. And given that it's being done in another country, I'm so excited about that. But I think by being authentic to who you are, and that civic engagement piece is being part of a core pillar, people read that out and they know that. And if that's what you are authentically about and you have already been about that, people are going to seek you out and they will find you. Your thing is just to make sure that you're constantly doing that, that despite or in spite of conditions that are currently happening, that you toe that line, you keep doing what you do. A very quick example, one, I love the intro that you all did to this webinar. It's extremely important. But I think about, with all of the unrest that's been happening here in this country, and, you've seen some entities, nod to and say, when it comes to racial violence, we don't tolerate that. Black Lives Matter, for example. And you've seen some people pushing back and saying, well, you've never been about that before. Why are you doing this now? And that is a very important lesson regarding the time, but then looking at how do you communicate and who are you communicating to 365 days of the year? Always, what are you about? People are going to be able to tell that. And that is key to authentically engaging audiences. If you all of a sudden start doing things that you think will attract a millennial audience, we're going to be able to sniff that out and say, this is not authentic. It could backfire. So I think authenticity and just consistency in your cadence are key to building up, new audiences. And that's why an entity like the library does really well.
There's such great insights. And, I think during my time in this sector, one of the things that I've commonly observed is a really deep fear of failure, right? So that the idea that if you try a thing and it doesn't work immediately, that it must have been the wrong thing and we have to stop immediately and try something else. And I think I love your perspective in saying like there is a long game here where authenticity, consistency, being value forward continues to express who you are. You don't stop with the outreach, you don't stop experimenting, but not every experiment works, but every experiment is something you learn from. So I'm going to pivot a little bit to a question that may be hard, but I'll give each of you an out. I'm interested if any of you be willing to share a story of failure, something you thought would be a real digital success and fell flat on its face. And if that's too hard for you, or if you have nothing but a track record of success, then the other possible question would be, is there anything you're seeing in other organizations that you envy, that you wish you could do when it comes to digital? So failure or envy. Victoria, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, so so we're going with the two polar opposites, eh? Envy and success. Okay, well, I really liked what somebody did during the pandemic, where they had everybody in their households replicating master artwork. I just thought that that was such a cool thing. I thought, wow, what a way to like get people working in their homes about these things. And there was one from our collection that somebody did, and I thought, well, that's pretty cool. So I thought that whoever thought that one up, and I you'll have to forgive me if I don't remember how it all started, but I liked how it went kind of viral, and a lot of people got into it. So I thought that was a fun. Oh, Getty. Okay, thanks for that. So yeah, I thought that was a really good example. And like challenges. Well, for us in Canada, we have a challenge related to our Indigenous people. We have, it's been covered in our news media quite a bit regarding the treatment by our RCMP, which traditionally has had this branding around the red coats and being on horses and all of that. And some of what's been coming out is rather horrible. And so before that had come out, the McMichael had a commitment to telling the story of Indigenous people. And there were some docents that weren't very comfortable telling the story if they were not Indigenous. So those of us who are docents that are involved with the Indigenous virtual tours, we say right out that we're not Indigenous. I happen to have worked for an Indigenous nonprofit at one point where in their mandate, they required that a certain amount of Indigenous people were on their board and were on their staff. So I mentioned that I do have some sensitivity when I'm involved with those programs. The other thing that I feel really good about is that the two people that I've been working with, one of them had worked in the same gallery that had represented Norval Morrisseau. So that makes me feel good when she says that. And then the other person that I work with, she had collected Inuit art for 40 years. So I like the stories that they tell when they talk about it from the perspective of multiple generations. And some of the stories we're telling are about Indigenous artists that were kidnapped when they were children and put in residential schools. And then they talk about how their family members introduced them to Indigenous art, and it became a family practice, whether it was stone work in the Inuit idea. And so one of them said that the residential schools were an education in forgetting, and that doing the artwork has been an education in remembering. So, you know, Dubé, like I'm apologetic for telling their stories, and that is a delicate thing. And one of the things that we are doing is that we are bringing Indigenous artists in to tell their stories, and we are commissioning new Indigenous artists as well. So, and we can tell the story of multiple generations. So there's a bit of a challenge here, but you know, our curator Sarah Milroy has said that it's important to find a safe place to have difficult conversations and not be colorblind. I think that, you know, it's incumbent on us to kind of realize the changing narrative around us. And I found the opening statement that was presented by the hosts of this to be quite impactful.
Thank you, Victoria. Heather, willing to share a failure story, or would you rather talk about envy?
I can share a failure story. So I mentioned that we had this series, this 5-piece living artist series and 5-piece curatorial series. And if you bought the whole series, you would be a member, or vice versa. If you were a member, you got them for free. But 0 people signed up to be members. So that was a failure, because once the first one went off, you know, there was no quote value in that situation anymore. So that was a failure, and but we're holding steady. Envy, you know, it was fun that Dupay brought the verses thing up. We did do another museum in Newark challenged us to a verses. We have the biggest object, or we have the most best cat, or, you know, a versus thing. And it was all done on live, and there was live voting. And actually it went really, really well. And so we probably will versus another museum in the near future. Could be one of you.
That's great. And, you know, stories of failure are super helpful because we all learn sort of like, ooh, we were thinking of that, or maybe we need to position that differently. So thank you for being vulnerable that way. Annie, are you willing to share a failure?
Always. I don't know, because I'm relatively new here. I'm just trying to think. I mean, ultimately, I think one of the things that happened with us was that we switched, like everybody, into really trying to think, indeed, not go dark, right? Be public and online, and that was very exciting. But what was very interesting was that the curators and other experts who were producing content had no idea about the amount of work it took to generate the program. So if anything, I set up an editorial digital group, and we had our comms team as well who kind of do that too. And it was a learning process, because, you know, on some levels, it was great for the curators to learn like what it takes to build, again, something consistent, authentic, voicing what you're doing, but also just the sheer skill level that they had no idea about. So I think it was more that we had a deluge of half-assed thoughts that didn't quite get finished. And that was a challenge. So there was a moment where we had to stall the ball and sort of say, okay, we're going to choose a few of these and we're just going to take our time. So I mean, while I slowed down some programming as a result of it, whereas I was hoping to unleash a lot of, you know, creativity, I think in the end, it was a really good learning process, to appreciate the incredible expertise and creativity of a whole other team. So in a way, I see it in the long term as breaking down this kind of gatekeeping that used to happen around curating. But the other more dramatic story, I don't know if it's failure, but it's certainly what stopped us and what has clarified my mind enormously is that we, when the pandemic hit Ireland, shutdown was very immediate in March originally, partly because our healthcare system is so delicate and really under-resourced that we can't afford a deluge. The system can't take it. So in a way, Ireland is very, very strict on lockdown. But within a week, I heard the news that the entire museum and the grounds were going to be shut, and we were going to become the house or site for an emergency mortuary. And again, we're thinking about those awful images in New York or in Italy of these refrigerated vans, and all the specter of death and catastrophe was so sobering and huge, and and then suddenly that we were the grounds for that. And I was thinking, how will we ever survive this image even of the site? And digitally, to try and get that message out there, I wasn't allowed to say anything because it was a governmental edict. They really wanted to control all the messaging. So even our own autonomy around our messaging at that moment was really challenged. But I think we survived, and that's why we've been trying to really activate in the most joyful manner possible and to rethink the site. But also, to be very sincere, we said at that moment that we thought it was a site of great dignity, and if this was the national project, we were willing to engage. So I think it's that feeling of we're in a very we need to be as authentic and as real as possible. So after that, we kind of had nothing left to lose. So we're pretty happy that luckily the mortuary wasn't used, and we're back, and people are identifying with our general core purpose again. But that was quite dramatic. So talk about fear of failure. It wasn't even failure; simply our entire purpose was wiped. You know, and that was amazing and interesting.
What a difficult situation. I'm really impressed with the sort of emotional intelligence with which you approach that. That's terrific.
Thank you.
Dupe, I'm not sure I've given you a chance to tell failure stories. Do you have any?
Yeah, I mean, I have to tip my hat to you, Annie, because I think that I mean, even if it is not having a choice, even the way that you're speaking about it with such care, it is representation of the organization's approach to being in that position, which is extremely important. To me, a lot of our work is rooted in civic engagement. As I mentioned, I mean, the shed is in this very sparkly, development called Hudson Yards, but the shed itself is on city-owned land. Because of that, I feel like we have a commitment to the residents of our city. And what does that mean in this moment? And what will it mean going forward? Failure is interesting because we are a startup. We operate startup-like. We're not afraid to fail. And so I think that as we think about it, as I'm thinking about it, we don't really look at things that aren't, extremely successful as failures. It's more of a cultural thing too for our institution. It's more of like, this is a teachable moment, and we, pivot. There's a lot of that happening constantly. I never imagined that working for an arts institution, that it would be so much like a tech organization, where it's constantly break, iterate, like it's constantly that. And as I mentioned, that being with the library before this, the library is not that. It's not that. It's kind of, we stick to what we do. But similarly, we learned lessons about what it actually takes, let me come back. Our team had to learn some lessons about what it takes to put on this type of programming and the actual bandwidth and capacity. My background is in news and it is in television. So I am used to very quickly, you got to put something together for air, 6:30, it has to be done. I think for our team, and being in this space, it is, taking the care and the time to curate and think and, and it's like, well, we need to, for the example, and I love what Victoria is saying about, about going dark and you're not really afforded that in this space, because this is directly, if you don't have program, what do you have to market? What do you have? What do you have? If you don't have program, the doors are closed. You have nothing. And so I think our team really, there were some growing pains in the beginning with seeing exactly what does it take and the cadence and the rigor around putting together a program on a digital platform. It's a night and day. I do envy, in the same way Heather versus. And so, here is something that started out very scrappily, 2 people in music, all they're doing is playing songs, and everyone goes crazy and they're online with them for 3 or 4 hours. And replicating that is something that I would love. And so Heather, I may take you up on your offer for that. I think they're such fun. And, they don't require much to do, interestingly. And so that model has been one that, from the very beginning that I have just, highly, I don't like the word envy because we're all in our lane, but admire. So
fair enough. I like it, admire over envy. So I'm looking at the Q&A, and there's some really important chatter in here about, it's around this question of balancing this rising demand for either digital media production or virtual programs when you have limited staff capacity, museums that have reduced hours, furloughs, layoffs. I mean, this is a tough question. There's also someone asking for me to talk more about what I've been up to. I do feel like it's my role on this panel to really elevate the voices of the panelists, but I want to take sort of a first quick run at this. I'll say there's sort of the retrospective and the forward-looking view. So the retrospective is I've been at MIA for about 9 years, and we put in a very intentional digital strategy and digital content production strategy 9 years ago. That gives us this deep well of very rich content that you can dial up, repurpose, and respin. I've also dedicated myself to building internal capacities. So for one example, and maybe other museums can do this, we had a bunch of people who were just sort of part-time AV support folks. Guess what? Those people know media. And if you give them a little bit of training, they can be great at video editing, sound editing, video production, audio production. They often have idle time because they're on site running projectors or something and just waiting for the program to be over. If they can fill that time by creating audio stops, your permanent collection, you can have real success with existing resources that you have. So train your AV folks. They can be really good at this. Yes, we had layoffs. Yes, I lost media production staff. That was devastating, not only just sort of emotionally, these are people that I recruited and hired and believed in, but it diminishes our capacity. So this is the forward-looking piece. If you have diminished capacity, there is no secret to this, folks. You need a plan. You need a plan. You need to know what you're doing, when you're doing it, who's doing it, and you need to share that plan, to develop it with everyone cross-functionally, and then share it widely so that, yes, everyone comes up with a brilliant idea, but if you're dealing with reduced capacity, you sort of need to line it up and say, great idea, we can do that in December because we have this capacity for doing this right now. So now let me throw that sort of back to any of the panelists. How are you dealing with perhaps diminished or lessened resources and approaching this idea that, you know, more digital when already making digital was tough? Anybody?
I wanted to jump in, Doug, if I can. I wanted to mention something that you were involved with that I was very impressed. You've been involved with the Museum Computer Network and a special interest group. And there was a very good video where you were highlighting one of your younger staff and, you know, giving them a chance to develop. And I just think that the Museum Computer Network is a good opportunity in the US at least. And I don't know if they have an international mandate, but do you want to say a little bit more about them to some of the people out there that don't know about it?
Sure, of course. So mcn.edu, because the organization is so old that there wasn't .org when it came online. The Museum Computer Network started out more than 50 years ago in New York City when some of the large art museums tried to connect their systems. It was a complete failure. The connections didn't work and the systems didn't talk to each other. But they loved working together so much that the organization sustained itself now for more than 50 years. Full disclosure, I'm a past president, so I'm a big fan. It is a good community of folks who do think about technology and digital, along with strategy and along with sort of community and values and how museums can function together. They will have a virtual conference coming up in the month of November, so maybe you want to dig into that. We have also worked with AAMC in more than one occasion to do sessions together, to do some content development together. So I thank you, Victoria. It's nice of you to put in a plug for an organization that I happen to love that is open to membership from anyone. And yes, there are certainly international members, and so it's ready that way. Anyone else dealing with sort of limitations, resource constraints? Maybe Heather, we haven't heard from you in a little while.
Well, I would say for our organization, we were before COVID, just digital was a real stretch. I don't think we were doing anything really actively digital other than a few Facebook Live posts every once in a while. So this was like instant front burner and instant training, and a lot of the same things that Annie was talking about, where curators are like, oh no, we have to do such special things to all of our art and all that to make it happen. I shouldn't talk that way, but it was hard to push to the 6:30 deadline. We got to get this done. We got to be out there. We can't be dark. So it was really hard. And I really love all my colleagues and commend them we really ramped it up. And I can't say enough about where we are right now compared to where we were in March. And I'm guessing there are a lot of other folks out there just like that.
Annie, you said you didn't have to do any layoffs. You've managed to hang on to staff, but do you have some constraints around digital production and virtual events, and how do you address those?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I keep banging on with my group about logistics, and I can see their eyes rolling to the back of their heads. And, you know, it is exactly that. It's the planning, and there's what's been really interesting in that shakedown is that idea of who's the holder of knowledge. You know, as you said, good communication platforms, digital, talk about digital. I just want them to share a plan for a show with everyone. You know, there's a way in which really getting much more fluid around how we share and use communication platforms stops the kind of crazy gatekeeping that was going on. Now, there is expertise, of course, but there's loads of other expertise that we're understanding, like, you know, from the digital, like the architectural, like whatever, the logistics of getting a show on the road or planning with reduced resources. And it's a struggle. I spend a huge amount of my time trying to manage that change within the organization, which is it's an organization that's 30 years old, but an awful lot of the staff would have been here for about 20, 25 years. So there's an awful lot of learned behavior that this disruptive pandemic plus, you know, how we're trying to work is actually uprooting. But it's a long haul. And it's really that simple. It is logistics and planning and trying to understand that we need shared platforms, and they're not going to be, I'm really trying to understand this level of fear that people have around communicating within the institution. And this is not the time for that. We're beyond that. Look what we've achieved. And even the idea of that Versus or TikTok or whatever, you know, this is the moment of joy and creativity coming from the amateur as well as the professional. And we need to embrace those things together. So indeed, like resourcing or repurposing your teams. I've been amazed by our visual education team. They have been creating sort of botanic wildlife tours on the site and things that they never had to do within the, you know, core of their work. So it's a chance to unleash all of this knowledge. So I think it's about stopping the gatekeeping and being really quite strategic with your resources.
Thank you, Annie. And you know, I'm looking at the clock and I'm feeling sad because I think I could talk with the four of you for the rest of the day and maybe the rest of the week. But I want to give each of you a chance. There must be something that we've forgotten to talk about, some other thing that's on your mind. So I'm going to go just one more time around the horn. Why don't I start with you, Victoria? Is there one other point or some summary point that you'd like to make or anything you'd like to emphasize?
So you started off, Doug, and kind of gave me a plug, and I gave you a plug for MCN. So I just want to thank you for that. In terms of digital strategies in my consulting business, it's very early on. So what I've been doing is I've been monitoring all sorts of things, and I've been, you know, kind of pitching and kind of viewing it as an opportunity to learn. And I guess I've been mending my nets, improving my digital toolkit, and wanting to be a learner. And you know, I'm willing to go on learning journeys with organizations. And I recently started to work with one of those technology entrepreneurs that I'm used to here, and we're starting to create workshops for nonprofit organizations so that we go in and we help train your team. Because, you know, when we were working with the nonprofit organization, they were saying, well, everybody's just doing this off the side of their desk, you know, that's what it is. And so we're going to go in and we're going to do some team development, and with the idea that, you know, we're just trying to help those people with their digital toolkits, because in the end, it's going to be their job. It's their content. You know, we're just learning with them.
Thank you, Victoria. I love the growth mindset. Heather, any final thoughts from you?
Well, I would say that on here at Chrysler, I'm pretty much convinced, and I don't know if everyone else is on my page, but I think digital is here to stay. It's going to be part of our mix of programming forever. I think it's absolutely a way to reach our brand further out into the world, not just from a revenue standpoint, but just from a brand standpoint. The Hampton Roads areas should be a destination. So there's a lot of, I think it's definitely for the future. We're not going to stop because the pandemic ends.
Thank you, Heather. Really good point. Annie, what can you share with us as we come around the corner here?
Well, I think just exactly what everybody's saying. You know, what has been a horrible sort of specter on one level has been the moment of great reset. Things are not working the way they were. Let's enjoy what we've learned. Let's look towards the future. Let's hang on for the ride. This great reset needs all of us to think the planet, the people, and the politics together. And I think we just need to really understand there's new models, and it's wonderful. It's a wonderful moment of creativity that can come out of this, I think.
Thank you very much. Dupe, I'm going to ask you to back clean up here. What final thoughts from you?
So I think, just to piggyback off of what everyone has said is that, digital is definitely here to stay. It isn't going anywhere. And at the same time, how can we, what's our obligation in the middle of all of this to and then some, right? So, we kind of all got thrown into this. I'm sure I know I left my building in March and thought, see you in 2 weeks. And here we are. It has been a challenging, yet historic time. I feel like we are all lucky to be doing this work at this moment in our history. And what does that mean going forward? Is one of the things that I'm constantly thinking about, and I think that you all are constantly thinking about. And how is this tool? Who knows what will be next? We're talking about this now. 20 years from now, it'll be not digital, but digital or something else. But what is it? How do we continue to stay in front of this? And where a tragedy doesn't have to happen in order for us to keep this mindset of being open. I love what you said, Annie, regarding these silos. I think even as institutions, we are siloed, and there's so much that we can learn from each other. And that has been one of the joyous things of this time and space, is that we've kind of not had any other choice but to lean into each other and say, what are you doing? How can we do this differently? What are the best practices? We're developing best practices in the 6-month period, but what can we learn from each other? And I hope that continues, where we don't keep these secrets, but we kind of work together within our institutions, and just across institutions as well.
Thank you for that. I actually had jotted down some of the same kind of points, right? Collaboration cross-institutionally is a terrific path forward. There are organizations who are helping to lead the way, and there are organizations who need help. And by working together, whether that's something like MCN or something like AAMC, sharing information in these webinars, opening ourselves up to contact, applying for grants together, whatever it may be, there's a real opportunity for us to be working together. There's a cliche that says a rising tide lifts all boats, and I think that can be very true. Thank you so much. And I think virtual applause from our attendees for all these terrific panelists and the points and examples you've given, the inspiration that you've shared. I know I feel energized by it. I really appreciate you joining us today. I appreciate AAMC for organizing this and putting us together. It's been great. And I think AAMC definitely looks forward to seeing you all at the next webinar. Enjoy the rest of your day, however many hours you may have left. Thank you.
Thank you, Douglas.
Thank you, Douglas. Thank you, everyone.
Hey,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Hello, I'm Monica Valenzuela, Program Manager for AAMC and AAMC Foundation. Thank you for joining our program today, and a special thanks to our speakers for sharing their experience and expertise with us. A recording will be available on our website, artcurators.org, and our YouTube channel shortly. Please help support our capacity to continue programs such as today's event by making a donation today. A gift of any amount will have a direct impact on our work. Thank you, stay well, and join us again soon.